Welcome to our debate, In the Beginning Was Nature, with Rupert Read, Alistair McIntosh, chaired by Caspar Melville, and with Benny Peiser. If you could give them a warm welcome, I would be grateful.
Thank you very much. May I first ask if everyone can switch their mobiles off or to silent so we don't get interrupted. We've got a fantastic topic today. In the Beginning Was Nature. It's about nature and spirituality, what kind of attitude we should have towards the natural world and to nature. I'm Caspar Melville. I'm the editor of New Humanist magazine, and I run something called the Rationalist Association, and I'm something of a professional atheist. So I've got particular interest in this area.
Does this mean God pays you to do the job?
No, unfortunately not. Not only do I not believe in him, but he doesn't pay
Oh, it's
me.
the other guy who pays you.
Ah, well that's an interesting idea. I just want to give, I'm going to introduce our speakers in a minute, and we're going to have a very lively, I hope, and interesting debate, but I just want to give from an outsider's perspective, because I'm not a professional environmentalist and I'm not deeply embedded in environmental issues, two things really. The first is to say, what an absolutely beautiful place Hay is, isn't it? I mean, walking around the place today, I live in South London, the idea of these beautiful green verdant hills, it really does fill you with a kind of love and a kind of awe and a kind of reverence. And so, albeit that I'm a professional skeptic and I've got problems with the whole issue of spirituality, and I don't really know what it means, and I don't really know how I should feel about things, I feel a strong pull towards nature. The second thing is to say, picking up The Guardian today, which I was reading with my breakfast, I came across a review of a new book which is called The Burning Question by Mike Berners-Lee and Duncan Clark, which is a new book about energy policy. And the book, the review said it was a good book, and it revealed two very interesting things. The first thing to bear in mind was that the city is betting very strongly against the idea that there will be any curbing of carbon emissions, because the value of the energy companies, that fossil fuel companies, is still very buoyant. So they're pretty well aware that nothing much is going to happen. And the second thing this book revealed apparently is that the switch to renewable energy has not had much impact on the production of carbon either, both of which suggest, and the book in general, that if there is a really big problem out there, no one's doing anything about it, and in fact the big money is betting that nothing will be done about it. So that's perhaps where we are in the conversation at the moment. And I suppose if you ask a lot of people about green issues, you get a number of different reactions, one of which is, yeah, we should probably be doing something about it, and the other is, I wish they wouldn't be so preachy. And this is where the idea of environmentalism as a kind of substitute for religion, or a new form of religion, something which you are being told by people all the time is something really important that you should do something about, is that an off-putting message? Anyway, my panel today, a very interesting group of people. On my right, far right, is Rupert Read, who is a philosopher, and he's chair of the Greenhouse think tank. And in his role as a philosopher, I hope he'll give us some purchase on historical, philosophical ideas about the sacredness or spirituality associated with nature. On my immediate right, Alistair McIntosh. He's an author and an activist. George Monbiot was very complimentary about his book Soil and Soul. And then on my left is Benny Peiser, who, it says here, he runs a leading climate policy network called CCNet. He also just told me that he co-founded the Green Party in Germany. I asked him if it was fair to describe him as a climate change skeptic, and he said, no, I'm an agnostic. So, those are our issues, and each of our speakers, I'm going to be quite tight on you, if you're going to take no more than 4 minutes to give us a kind of top-line view on how you look at the issue of nature and spirituality. I'm going to start with Rupert over there.
Thanks. Okay, so first point, Greens environmentalists are relentlessly pro-science. They're not necessarily pro every technology that is out there, because technology is a political decision. But science is a factual question, and we're relentlessly pro it. Those in denial about fundamental scientific facts are the anti-science people. Second point, this is not fundamentally a scientific debate, the debate we're having this afternoon. In fact, it's hardly a scientific debate at all. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, the crucial elements of the fundamentals of the science, so far as ecology is concerned, so far as dangerous climate change is concerned, are settled. Not completely settled. If they were completely settled, it wouldn't be science, right? The definition of science is that there is a research frontier, things are always being found out. But the basics are settled. Secondly, this is not mostly a scientific debate, because insofar as there are major uncertainties in the area of environmentalism, in the area of environment, in the area of dangerous climate change, they make it more rather than less crucial that action is taken. This is a point that is very often missed. our fundamental attitude towards our world, towards our planet, ought to be one of precaution, ought to be one of not recklessly taking risks. So when there are deep uncertainties, that should make us more rather than less concerned to act decisively, to act precautiously. So when the scientific models are unclear, that makes it more, not less important that we act, and that is widely misunderstood and widely abused by so-called climate skeptics. Third point, environmentalism is mostly about our attitude to the earth and to each other. Right? So it's not mostly a scientific question, it's mostly a question of our attitude, it's a question of politics, it's a question of, among other things, spirituality. It's about our attitude to the earth, obviously, because the earth is our home, it's our life support system. How ought we to think about this place? How ought we to feel towards it? And it's about our attitude towards each other. Greens, environmentalists, are relentlessly pro-people. We care about the planet because, above all, we care about people, including, crucially, future people, who are being stomped all over at present by business as usual. And if the city is right and we don't take strong, precautious action soon, then future generations will inherit a nightmarish pale shadow of the beautiful earth that we currently have. So the question is about what our attitude is towards the earth, and what our attitude is towards other species, and what our attitude is towards each other, and most crucially towards our children and our children's children, who are the most vulnerable of all. And it's about what we're going to do about all of this. So it's about action, it's about practice. Again, nothing really to do with science. Fourth point, what do I therefore think our attitude towards nature ought to be? Well, I'll say more about this as the afternoon unfolds, but briefly, I think we ought firstly to have an attitude fundamentally of respect towards nature. I'll be talking about this more tomorrow, little advert. Tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, do come along to the Ring if you want to hear myself and Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, talking together about the way that, for example, we ought to respect nature, because nature knows a lot more than we do. Nature has been through billions of iterations, whereas when we, for example, invent a new drug, it's brand new. Our attitude towards nature, therefore, ought to be, as I've already suggested, fundamentally precautious. I would add, however, that my own personal belief, and I'm not necessarily saying that everyone has to share this, although I think it would be a good idea if a lot more people did, is that we ought to go beyond just respecting nature. We ought to also, I believe, to revere nature, to have an attitude of thinking that nature is sacred in just the kind of way that religions used to say that other things were sacred. Again, I remind you, these are not fundamentally scientific questions. In fact, it is a total misunderstanding to pretend that the question of whether or not we ought to revere nature is itself a scientific question. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. I think that's clear from any decent philosophy. It's a total mistake to think that these deeply important questions could conceivably be scientifically settleable. And so I'm with Heidegger, the great philosopher, one of the great philosophers of the last century, who argued that the world, the earth, should not be seen as a set of resources to be exploited. As I say, my own view is that the best way we can put ourselves in a position to respect nature is to revere it. But as I say, I don't want to absolutely insist on that. I am perfectly prepared, as a practical green politician, which is also something I do in my spare time, to have completely common cause with people who, such as perhaps our chair, who don't think that nature should be revered, but who do think that nature should be respected. And that's enough, I think, to set out the basics of my platform.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Alastair. Now, I don't know if you were going to mention it, but you did on the way down mention to me that you were a Quaker. You are a religious believer of a kind, and you have a concept of God, and therefore you presumably are positing a relationship between nature and God. Do you, perhaps you're going to talk about that in your introduction. That's just my intro.
4 minutes.
Go ahead. 4 minutes.
I was raised on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. And when you go out in the clear night, you get yourself in cosmological proportion. And when you put to sea in a boat, you have to be extremely grounded in what reality is doing, or else you drown. Reality is not a social construction. Reality is bottom line physical reality. you don't find many postmodernists up a mountain. And because you're pushed to think about the structure of reality, it also binds you in with social reality. Because in a living indigenous community, such as the one where, by good privilege, my father was the village doctor, in such a community, which at that time in the 60s and 70s was still very based on the land and the sea, you're only able to interconnect with ecological reality in harmony with other human beings, in community with others. And so such communities tend to be deeply religious, albeit a Calvinistic Presbyterianism on my island, which wasn't what I was drawn to, hence why I found my way towards the Quakers. Now the Quaker understanding, my own understanding, is that this thing to which we give the name God, or Allah, or Brahman, or the goddess, or the divine, I don't care what we want to call it, Jesus Christ, or whatever we want to call it, is the ground of being. Everything that we are, everything that we move amongst, this whole earth, including our social realities, is constantly emerging out of this. Don Cupid, talking privately to me yesterday, used the image of a fountain that is constantly replenishing. Except when I asked him, do you think we are conscious? And he said, yes. And I said, do you think this life is conscious? He said, no. That is where I would disagree. My ontology is that our brains are not the means of producing consciousness, but the means of receiving it. We move in this realm of profound interconnection that is the divine million. It's like these fingernails are each of our ego selves. There's you, there's me, there's Benny, there's the next person. And at this level here, the islands are connected beneath the sea, the bedrock of reality, the divine ground of our souls. And so our relationship to one another depends upon our state of consciousness. And our state of consciousness depends upon how committed we are towards love. How much we are willing to tackle this area of the shadow side of ourselves and one another in order to break through down into the spiritual realm where you learn the meanings of love through the difficult issues that the world throws up. I see climate change as just one further configuration of the difficulties that life throws up. To me, the small question is what can we do about climate change? To what extent is it anthropogenic or not? The big question that climate change pushes us towards, or which our multiple wars push us towards, or the reality of poverty, or ethnic or sexual discrimination push us towards. The big question is, what does it mean to be a human being? This is a question that the old Hebrew prophets started us on. It's a question Jesus advances on. The Buddha, the pagan people with nature religion lead us on. And so I see the environment as profoundly about a spiritual experience of life and about the learning context in which we discover what it means to be more fully human.
I'm going to guess that was exactly 4 minutes as well. I just feel that you know these sort of things.
I was reading your body language. That's
Were you? Very. I'm going to ask you the same question to say the same thing. I'll just to sort of keep the frame of the issue in mind. I find myself, I really adore Quakers, and I find you're so persuasive, and yet I'm also bridling at this spirit talk and soul talk, and I just wonder if that one of the things we'll be discussing is that potentially going to put people off if they don't know what it is or have a problem with that. Anyway, Benny, for you and your relationship to nature, is it a spiritual relationship?
No, it's not a spiritual relationship. It is a love affair. You don't need to be spiritualistic to love nature and love the countryside and certainly want to protect nature. But I come from a traditional Enlightenment tradition and view, and from a humanistic perspective, which puts humans still in a special role on this planet. Deep ecology has undermined the preciousness of humankind. And I look at environmental issues from a social and a moral perspective. I come from environmental background, as I was one of the co-founders of the Green Party in Germany back in the 70s, and I fell for a lot of the hysteria and a lot of the scares at the time, not realizing that we were already in the 70s and 80s actually moving to a much more environmental friendly way of living compared to the 19th century, for instance, and that we had to weigh up human well-being with taking risks. So I think that we are risk takers. There's simply no way that humans can avoid taking risks. It's trial and error. That's how we have evolved. That's how we are who we are. There is simply no way that you can just try to protect the status quo. Every new drug, every new technology includes risk, and unless you're willing to take these risks, there won't be any progress. And so therefore, my view is that to err is human, and to progress is to take risks. And that includes the balance between protecting the environment and intervening into the environment. Because the reason why everything looks so beautiful here is not because this is nature as it was 10,000 years ago, but because people have farms, and this is all mainly man-made, what we are seeing, and we love it. Of course, we don't want everything with roads and high-rise buildings, but people have to live somewhere, and people have to live from something. So farming is something that is very intensive and provides us with cheap food, but it intervenes into the landscape, and we obviously want to do it in a way that is sustainable, that's for sure. So I am coming from a very green background, have become much more of a rationalist and a moderate, and think that the deep greens are over-egging the kind of doom and gloom that we're facing. I think actually that economic growth is at the very heart of environmental protection. You just need to compare the environment in poor countries with the environment in wealthy countries to see that it's a luxury to look after your environment. And people whose first and second and third priority is to find food and work, they won't take care of their environment. So I am a rational environmentalist and think every issue has to be assessed, critically assessed on its own accord, in its own right, and there are no simple solutions. Every solution includes taking some risks, and sometimes we get it wrong, and then we learn from our lessons and get it right in the second or third time.
Thank you. I want to go back to Rupert on this issue of then not so much a spiritual relationship as a love affair. I mean, we know that they can go wrong and people can be misused, but why is it that I shouldn't view nature as a resource for me? I mean, you know, I'm part of nature as well. We're part of nature, so isn't it, as it were, as natural as anything else that I would choose to quote unquote exploit natural resources for my own benefit? After all, that's how human culture has evolved and survived. Are you arguing against that? And if you are, how should we be? You know, what kind of spiritual framework should structure our employment of the resources to further our lives?
Well, you're right, of course, that human beings can be regarded as part of nature. Would you think it was a good idea if human beings were regarded as a resource to be exploited? I take it the answer to that question is pretty obvious. You don't need to answer.
Well, I have a job. You know, I have a job, and for the
look. If
so I'm clearly a resource that is exploited, and I'm paid for it.
And that's part of the problem with capitalism, red and tooth and claw, right? If that was the way in which human beings always regarded each other, then there would be no point in living at all. So the question is this: should we regard nature in the way that it is repellent to fundamentally regard human beings. And my suggestion is that the answer to that question is no. I'm glad that we all agree that we should have love for nature. In terms of the question of soul, by the way, there's a lovely couple of quotes from Wittgenstein, my favourite philosopher. Wittgenstein says, "The best picture of the human soul is the human body." And he also says, "The face is the soul of the body." So what I'm meaning by that is, when we talk about soul, when we talk about sacredness and so on, it doesn't need to be assumed that we have in mind some very, very heavy metaphysical, ontological commitments. Alastair might, but I largely don't. And what I think is that, well, one of the things I think is that our best chance of saving ourselves is to regard nature in a way something like the way in which we regard ourselves. It's also very important to be clear here that that when we are trying to think about ourselves in, or as you said, as nature, that we don't fall into the illusion of thinking that we can think of ourselves as fundamentally separate from nature. And that is exactly the mistake that Benny makes, right? The fantasy that we can think about ourselves, humans, as in this kind of Promethean form, as being over and above nature, able to dominate it, take from it what we will, have a fundamentally rationalist attitude towards it. That's where the Enlightenment goes wrong. It's exactly the same place, incidentally, where the classic monotheisms go wrong. So in this way, of course, Enlightenment belief looks just like another religion. Progress. You can't stop progress. What is that if not a religious attitude? The veneration of economic growth. You yourself said that.
I didn't say you can't stop progress.
No, you did. You said that you thought that we should have progress. Progress was essential. We wouldn't have progress without risk taking. So you're in that way setting up progress as a telos that we must definitely try to achieve. And what I'm suggesting is that is roughly speaking a religious attitude. It's a bad religious attitude as opposed to a good religious attitude. What we want to have is real progress in the things that actually matter. Why do we need more economic growth? Do we need more stuff? Do we need more things? How many people, if we shared adequately in the world today, wouldn't have enough stuff, right? It's Benny's side of the argument that actually is not prepared to examine its own fundamental assumptions, whereas it's Greens and ecologists who are putting forward a perspective that actually gives us a real hope for the future.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to set you up in a minute.
I love it.
Good. I'm going to go to Benny first, and I'm going to ask you to answer. You mentioned deep. You've been criticised from that side. You've mentioned deep Greens. Isn't it the case that actually sometimes environmentalism does sound a bit like a religion? It sounds self-righteous. It sounds like a kind of program of things you have to sign up to. It sounds like where are the boundaries? I mean, Rupert's asked us to, consider environmentalism is also about sharing more, not having so much stuff. I mean, it's a kind of left-wing, notionally left-wing agenda. I'm not saying I don't agree with it, but it's asking us to sign up to a hell of a lot and using a kind of strong moral urgency about it. Sometimes it can, and then it can treat people who don't follow the dogma as heretics. Is that a fair picture?
For some within the Green movement, I think it is a fair comment. But my main criticism isn't the kind of outside of the Green movement. This is more the kind of internal structure where strong beliefs, almost utopian, apocalyptic thinking mirrors the traditional apocalyptic religions. My main criticism is that this kind of thinking is only applicable to people who live in the wealthy world. In the rest of the world, where people do need jobs and they need to survive and they need development, they need economic progress. For them, this is all completely irrelevant. The impact of some of the green policies on the developing world is disastrous, and it's or amoral to take such a view, to underestimate and ignore the needs of millions and millions of people who rely on progress and economic development. You can even look in the UK, some of these policies hurt the most vulnerable, hurt poor people, because they have to pay for the luxuries of landowners who can afford to, put up these windmills and make millions in the subsidies. And the very, very vulnerable people have to pay for that. And there are so many other examples. So I'm not a deep philosopher. I look at these issues case by case. And what I find deeply worrying is the lack of reflection and self-criticism within the Green movement, and that makes it a bit cult-like. The lack of saying, look, there are so many things we might get wrong, perhaps we should change that, we have to look after people who aren't as well off as we Greens are. It is, obviously we can see that around the world, the Green philosophy and the Green view of life is something that is really limited to the middle classes and even the upper middle classes.
If that's true, why is it the case that there are now far more environmental protests in China than any other kind of protest?
Why? It's simple. They want clean water, they want clean air.
Yeah, and why aren't they getting it? Because of your wonderful development.
They will get it, just as we protested for clean water and clean air until we got it. And they will
what they're
get
getting is desertification and terrible smog crises and so on and so forth.
They are going through what we went through in the 19th century.
Yeah.
But they might get to our situation.
And how many
faster.
Earths are we going to have to need in order to all live at the standard of living that we live at in the West at the moment?
So are you
the
asking?
answer is about 3.
But
Are
you therefore saying that in order to fulfil the environmental agenda, the West is going to have to give up, as it were, if not everyone can be like
or
we
the Chinese can't.
if they're not allowed to become like we are because the Earth couldn't possibly sustain too many, do we have to renounce? Which also sounds somewhat religious in tone. Should we be giving away our stuff?
Use the word renounce.
But
what I said is we have to share. Excuse
how
me.
much more stuff?
Chair, if I may. What I said is we have to share, right? And so yes, the answer to your question is roughly yes. That we in the West need to not hog the vast amount of dangerous energy resources, for example, that we are currently burning. And insofar as there is that those resources should be burnt at all, which is not terribly far, then we need to share that out equitably. And there is a proposal for doing that. It's called contraction and convergence, and the idea is that we should all contract our CO2 emissions to a level, a convergent level, such that they're all the same, such that we can all live and survive and have a future. It seems to me rather a sensible idea.
Okay, now I'm going to turn to Alastair and set you up as a high priest of environmentalism.
Oh, wonderful.
You spoke to my ear like a priest, like a very, like a very persuasive priest. You spoke about soul, you posited ideas and you put them beautifully, but there are ideas which in other mouths I have found very difficult to take. They remind me of, Californian New Ageism and a kind of squishy, squashy idea that we're all made of the same stuff. Does it worry you that you might be putting off people who might be allies using that kind of language? Or is it actually inherent in what you're trying to do that is it a better tactic to sort of try and win them over to that position? Is it necessary that I adopt your position on relationship to nature in order to do what needs to be done?
I would just urge you to be true to reality as you experience it. The spirituality of which I speak is coming empirically out of my reality from personal experience. In Soil and Soul I described 2 major campaigns that I was a leader in, one of the leaders in, the Isle of Egg community land buyout and the campaign to save Mount Rogneville from destruction as a super quarry. And in both those situations it was profound, by which I would mean metaphysical to the point of mystical connection with people and place that at crucial times helped to carry and give courage to that campaign. Now that's my experience, which I've testified to, and I know many other people, especially in my kind of community, which is a community of the poor. Both the one I was raised in the Outer Hebrides, national incomes are only about 2/3 of what they are elsewhere in the UK, and when I was a boy it was very much less. It was a subsistence agriculture, and where I live now in Govan, which is a hard-pressed area of Glasgow, that it is people's direct experience, that connection with the beauty of nature, and sometimes especially when they're very poor, is all they've got. And that's why it's all the more awful when industrial interests or landowner interests violate what little they've got.
Don't you think that you need a kind of passion that Alastair described in order, that we need people who are inflamed with a kind of zeal or zealotry about what needs to be done? I mean, you presumably you don't think this?
No, I think it's always dangerous if people become zealots. Always, whatever the cause. Because for most problems that we have, we humans, there is no simple one-way solution. You always have to weigh up different approaches. You always have to realize that whatever path you take and whatever policy you introduce, it will not be 100% without a cost, without a risk. Therefore, people who are zealots, who are dogmatics, who are extremists, always get it wrong. Even if they're right, they get it wrong because they don't realize that part of being human is to make compromises. And you always have to compromise, as I said. And that is our relation to nature. We cannot live in nature without intervening. Particularly not a modern society, a modern civilization, with all the trappings. And let's not forget that we are here because of fossil fuels. Britain wouldn't be Britain without coal, without natural gas, without nuclear energy, right? We wouldn't be here just with the sun and the wind. And we won't be here in 100 years just with sun and wind. We will have very, very complex, highly technology-driven economies and highly risky forms of technologies. And that is part of being a modern society. And you can't avoid it. You can't claw back and go back to the Middle Ages or even, that's the problem. So you have to accept that being human in a high-tech society means taking difficult decisions that include risky paths. Without it, there won't be any progress.
Alistair?
I mean, I'm not advocating going back. I'm advocating a spirituality that is about going forward. Recently, we put solar panels on our roofs, a 4-kilowatt system on our roof in Govan in Glasgow, £5,000, the price of a good second-hand car. So it's not exactly out with most people's pockets. Now, we only use just over 3,000 units of electricity a year, and this system, and so far it's performing to fit, is producing 3,000. So we're going to be getting about 90% of our electricity off the roof. Furthermore, for £2,000, we put in an air-to-air heat pump, a Bosch Worcester heat pump. In April and May, with an average temperature of 7 degrees only, that's provided all our household heating, and the only gas we've used is for the bath at night, which my wife said I wasn't to embarrass her by telling everybody, but frankly we share it together.
I'm very glad to hear it.
Now, are you saying the world
we're living, in the shoulder time of year, not the coldest time of year when we will need gas again, but in the shoulder time of year, we are living and working from home off what's coming off our roof.
So you're not against technology or quote-unquote
Oh, not
progress?
at all. I mean, I love technology. The question is not whether it is a high technology or a low technology. The question is always, what does it serve?
Rupert, I want to bring you in I know you've got something to say, but I want to ask you a question as well. You criticised Benny earlier, and you kind of almost threw it back to him and said that progress is a bit like a kind of a religion, implicitly, therefore not a good thing. Would you not recognise that sometimes environmentalism can sound a bit too much like a religion or be a little bit full of zealotry, and pragmatically there might be some dangers in hyping up the spiritual element of it as opposed to the more pragmatic aspects of it?
Yeah, I think what care is needed as to where and when, with what audience one talks about the spiritual dimension here. And as I said in my initial talk, I think that we need to have a broad coalition to make the huge changes that we have to make to our world if there's going to be a civilization in 100 years. I totally agree with that. In terms of sounding preachy, Well, that's a question of being careful in how one communicates. I think that a lot of the talk about Greens being preachy and so on comes from those who want to find a way of, a cheap way generally, of criticising Greens and environmentalists. And the hidden, or often not so hidden agenda there, is that the main reason why many such people, including, for example, many of our large national newspapers, want to attack Greens is they want to preserve the status quo, because that's in their very short-term interest. And let's be clear about it, let's be frank about it, let's be honest about it. The main reason that people deny that dangerous climate change is happening is if they don't want to change their lives. They don't want to change their lives, they don't want to change their businesses, they don't want to change their attitudes, so they pretend that the facts are other than they actually are. And that is, it seems to me, a deep human failure, and it's something we have to overcome if we're going to bequeath a legacy to our children and our children's children. I wanted to come back to Benny's stuff about, well, look, what I'm talking about is stuff that's good for the third world, good for people, and so I pointed out that many people in the third world are environmentalists. But the group that I really want to hammer home about today is not so much people in the so-called third world, it's future people. It's people who are completely voiceless because they're not here yet. And we really badly need to raise our vision from the next 5 years or the next 10 years to the next 100 years or the next 1,000 years. And when Benny talks about saying, well, we've got to weigh things up, we've got to balance things, we've got to compromise things, we've got to take risks, what we must not do is gamble with the very future existence of our children's children and our children's children's children. That is what is totally irresponsible. That's what I'll be talking about in my talk with Alastair tomorrow morning. We must have a fundamentally precautious attitude towards preserving the conditions of life here on Earth.
But don't you also need people to be questioning the dogmas which are being generated by any particular belief? I mean, in my limited understanding of what the role that Benny plays in this, and you've been critical of him, is that he, for some people, is an irritant because he's not following, a line about what's really happening. Maybe you think that's irresponsible, but don't we actually need people to be doing that? Isn't that part of a healthy debate, driving it forward, helping people like me who don't know much about it understand by having the argument in public? Isn't that helpful?
Well, look, I'm a philosopher, so I believe in fundamentally questioning everything. But there are genuine debates, and then there are fake debates, right? So the debate about whether or not the Earth is flat is a fake debate. And if people say, well, we need to have a balanced debate, and people should question their assumptions about whether the Earth is really round, it's just stupid. In a way not dissimilar to the way in which the most climate change denial is just stupid. It's just a non-starter. It's just a pathetic, outdated excuse for people not wanting to change their lives, not wanting to address the big questions. So please, let's address the big questions. And I love talking with Alastair about these things and some of the differences we have about what exactly it means to be spiritual and so on. But let's not use the idea of deep questioning and being philosophical and so on to raise, frankly, stupid or irrelevant or dangerous questions.
Well, this is a typical example of the dogmatism of the Greens, that they say certain areas are just off the debate and should not be mentioned and should not be discussed because...
So what about flat earthism? Do you think we should discuss that?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Well, that's fine. Then I think
of course,
if
there are people who want to discuss it, I wouldn't deny them the right to discuss. If you want to deny it, you need a green dictatorship to deny
it. Oh, don't be absurd. Look, if you understand any basic science, you know that the idea of a flat Earth is absurd. So, if you understand any basic science, you know that the greenhouse effect is real. It's pointless to go back over things that have been scientifically settled. Let's have debates about the real questions. And the real questions, for example, are, should we take a fundamentally precautious attitude or not? And you say not. And we can have that debate. I think it's completely irresponsible to say...
This has, you're mixing here two things. You're mixing two things. On the one hand, you're saying, I want to decide which things should be debated and which things shouldn't be debated. I'm saying we're living in so far, still, in an open society, and nothing should be off the...
So let's teach children the...
teach? We're not talking about teaching here.
Excuse me, if you're right that we should reassess everything all the time, then when children are taught in school about astronomy, they should be taught flat earthism as well as round earthism. They should be taught about... Yes, that's the implication of what you're saying.
No.
Because you're saying that everything should be able to debate.
No. The implication of what I'm saying is that if there are people who think they can prove that the Earth is flat and not round, they should not be put in prison or shut up because
They
they
said
have,
anything about putting people in prison.
well, if you want to deny them the right to discuss it, how do you do that? How
But
do you deny it?
surely what you do is what we got in our school. We were told the flat Earth theory. We were told the spherical theory.
And you show them what the best evidence
and then
is.
you know, we were asked, what happens when you stand on the beach and watch a ship sail into the distance? Empiricism.
Yes.
And you know, to my mind, the ecology we're talking about, including the climate change ecology, and the spirituality that I at least am talking about, is empirically based. It is, you know, thou shalt believe that which is thine own experience.
But do you think the science is so overwhelming, like the flat Earth example, that if it were laid out, the climate, I know that I don't want to get into too much about the
No,
climate science,
absolutely.
but is the science so overwhelmingly in support of the idea
of
of
the
climate
spherical-
change that it would be
Of climate change.
yes, that if it were laid out in front of people, I mean, to my view, it seems A, much more complicated than the flat Earth issue and not so easily amenable to a simple proof. B, new stuff is coming up all the time about it, which needs to be accommodated. You know, why is it colder now? What's happening to the ocean? Which is the big issue? Is it the amount of carbon that's being held here or there? I mean, it's very, very complicated.
But you see, I think the problem here is that there is a very strong scientific consensus on climate change, as we know from the IPCC
So,
and
Indeed, there's a
other
strong
supporters.
consensus in the Catholic
Now,
Church.
What does it mean?
now that is all in flux.
Yeah.
A good example being the paper published in Nature 2 weeks ago that suggested that the Earth is not warming quite as fast as was previously thought.
Indeed.
By a factor of something like
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah.
Now, I brought along my homework with me. Here's the guy who wrote that, or the lead author of that paper, Alexander Otto, being interviewed by the BBC, and he's saying we would expect a single decade to jump around a bit, but the overall trend is independent of it, and people should be as concerned as before about what climate change is doing, said Dr. Otto. Question: is there any succor in those findings for climate skeptics who say that the slowdown over the past 14 years means that global warming is not real? None. No comfort whatsoever, he said. Now what we've got there is a scientific debate that is going on in a perfectly respectable manner. I'm sure that Benny would appreciate the manner that's conducted in. The problem is that this gets picked up by your consumerist media, who are funded by keeping the status quo going. And they don't want to hear the qualification there. The only thing they want to hear is that climate change is slowing down. Therefore, we saw Bjorn Lomborg
Yeah.
getting
The sceptical
two
ecologist.
skeptical
Environmentalist. Yeah.
getting 2 full pages in the Sunday Times the other day in order to pump his point of view. And what were they predicated on? It all sounded so reasonable because, of course, he's coming out of a business school. And what he's saying is that when you carry out the proper economic calculations on the cost per ton of carbon, it's only going to have £3.50 cost per ton. It's nothing. Forget about it. Well, what business schools do, when they look at future costs, future damage, they apply discounted cash flow methodology to discount the children's future down to a net present value. And as soon as you apply DCF methodology in investment appraisal with any significant real positive rate of interest, even just 2 or 3%, anything that's more than about 30 years on gets discounted back to zilch in net present value. That's why we put up buildings that only last for 30 years, because it doesn't make economic sense to build a building that lasts for more than about 30 years with this mindset. But what that mindset violates is the earth itself. It's the labour of those who work on the earth. It is only a mathematician's way of looking at it that only serves to concentrate capital.
Now, I'm going to throw this open to the audience in just a second, but I want to ask Rupert, it sounds a little bit like, if you're trying to appeal to someone like me, let's say, you're suggesting a kind of version of Pascal's wager in relation to the environment.
Absolutely.
That actually, whether or not I completely buy the science, and whether or not I buy the spiritual soul relationship, the bottom line is it'd be better to do something than not do something, just in case it were the case, and wouldn't that be actually the right thing to do anyway? Is that a fair?
That's absolutely right. That's a very helpful way of putting it. Thank you, Chair. And this is again what I'll be talking about with Nassim tomorrow morning, how what we have from philosophers like Pascal and William James is a basis for thinking about how our attitude ought to be fundamentally precautious. So going back to the climate case again, for example, even if the models weren't really strong, which they are, even if the consensus wasn't overwhelming, which it is, even if the observations weren't overwhelming, which they are, it would still be profoundly irrational to just carry on throwing up tons and tons of this stuff into the atmosphere all the time, carrying out a giant uncontrolled experiment which is hugely asymmetrical, because any gains that we get from it can never be compensated by the potential terrible downside for future generations who are not going to have those short-term gains. So absolutely, we ought to think in roughly the way that Pascal suggested. I think Pascal was wrong about religion, by the way, but I think with regard to these kinds of questions, he was basically right.
I'm going to assume you don't agree with that, but I want to go to the audience now, and it will hopefully come up. So have people got questions? Yes, there's a lady right here. Please.
Thanks.
Can you hold the mic right up? Because I'm really deaf, so I'll only hear from very loud.
I'll repeat it if
Okay.
you need me to. Yeah. If need be.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I love the fact that within the first few minutes, all of you used the word love, and that's just great. That we need to love the earth and nature. Need to. It's all about love, really.
Yeah.
I'm a green. I'm sick of hearing about climate change. I hate being called a denier and agnostic. It puts everybody off. Everybody turns off the radio, the TV when they hear climate change. People go to conferences. Is it happening? Is it isn't? Makes no fucking. It doesn't matter whether it's changing or not. I don't care. We're plundering, polluting, poisoning the earth, and we've got to stop doing it. And I think to engage people, we've got to shut up about climate change, because whether it's changing or not, we know what we've got to do. I just want to know what you all think about that.
Let's talk to people who haven't shut up about it. I'm going to come to you, Rupert, but Alastair, should you shut up about climate change and spend more time? I mean, I found myself...
criticism of any of
No,
you. I love
understood.
you all.
But do you think that strategically, you're suggesting almost that it'd be better to talk about the spiritual stuff? I mean, I found it very moving when you started to talk almost in terms of the fact that you could love your solar panels. That actually your love for nature could include the things that you've made. Do you think there's been, that you've got a green here saying, can we stop talking about climate change? Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there was a problem around about 2007 and the run-up to Copenhagen in 2009. There was a very concentrated effort by the Green Movement worldwide to bring the world leaders to Copenhagen, because the situation is so concerning, and there was a hope that you could get worldwide agreement on significantly cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So it's kind of like all of the energy and much of the funding got pumped into that. And things like local wildlife reserves and protecting places from overdevelopment and things like that often got put on the back burner for a time. And personally, I think that was damaging. And yet, how do you actually play out strategy in a situation like this? If you're going to try and get world governments to converge in one place, then you need pretty intense effort, particularly if you don't have the power of corporations, etc., behind you. The problem was, of course, that in some ways, in my view, it was perhaps a misguided strategy, because they came, they saw, and they decided not to conquer. And I think that there's been a big issue that many of us greenie types are content to live a relatively, I would call it a way of life based on sufficiency rather than surplus, but we're content to earn and live on less than many other people would. I earned £15,000 last year, which is, keeps me in comfort, but a lot of people would say, well, that's nothing at your age and stage in life. I couldn't possibly do that. Now, I'm content to do that, and so I'm content to advocate policies consistent with that. The problem is that an awful lot of people out there in our democratic electorate are not content to do that, and so I think that the Greens perhaps misinterpreted the context they were working on, and there is now ground to be reclaimed in terms of bringing all of these other things back into the picture, and yet that doesn't stop the CO2 rate going up and up by 3 or 4 points.
I just wanted to go to Benny before we come to Rupert. Should we shut up about climate change? You go on about it a lot, I understand, in your work. I mean,
well, I find it interesting, the comment, because it would suggest that there is a kind of public backlash And you wonder if it's such an urgent issue where we have to save the planet, why does the public suddenly turn against the idea? One of the reasons, of course, is that everyone wants to protect the environment. Everyone. But there's a limit to how much they're willing to spend on protecting the environment. And what is now becoming obvious is the only people who are actually making billions out of this whole climate change business are the green investors, including the energy companies who are getting hundreds of millions of subsidies every year, and landowners and people who have the luxury to put a 20,000 or 30,000 pound solar panel on their home.
No, 5,000. Yours was 5,000.
5,000.
Yeah,
okay, 5,000. But on average, they are, I think, a little bit more than that. It's basically in Europe, what we're seeing is the biggest wealth transfer in modern history from the poor to the rich. In Europe, over the last 8 years, 600 billion euros have been spent on renewable subsidies all over Europe, not just Britain. So 600 billion euros that are going from ordinary families to the landowners and the people who have put solar panels on their nice homes. People are not that daft. They realize that their energy bills partly are going up as a direct result of these green subsidies, partly. And they do realize that perhaps climate change is not an imminent global disaster, and that we might have a little bit more time to think about what the appropriate and more effective policies might be. After all, in Britain and in much of Europe, the companies are going back to coal of all forms of energy, because the Greens have until now prevented anyone from getting to the cheap shale gas. So Europe is going back to coal. In the US, it's the exact opposite. They are shifting from coal to natural gas, and the CO2 emissions in the US are back where they were in the 1990s. They're actually decreasing. In Europe, the emissions are going up because the Greens have shut down nuclear power plants and are against shale gas, two of the lowest forms of energy. So what I'm saying is the reason why many Greens don't want to talk about climate change anymore, because it's no longer a very popular topic. And the reason why it's not very popular, because people are realizing that A, it has been overhyped, and B, they are paying far too much to the wrong people.
Rupert, should we all shut up about climate change, or just Benny shut up about climate change?
I'll come to that in 1 second. Let's keep our eyes on the real issue, which is the possibility of civilization on this planet surviving and flourishing into the future. And even if what Benny has just said were true, then it would still be the case that we are stamping collectively on the faces of future generations. And there are untold millions of them that we are stamping on. Why should we not completely, I agree with what Alastair said, but why should we completely not shut up about dangerous climate change? Because the UN has said very clearly that the two great threats, the two great planetary boundaries that we have already passed in recent years are a biodiversity boundary. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction in history, and this time it's caused by one particular species, and the climate change boundary. There are real risks there, not computable. That's why we need to be precautious in guarding against them. There are real risks that we could foment some kind of runaway dangerous climate change within the next 50 to 100 years. 50 to 100 years sounds a long time, the lifetime of any of us. Most of us will be gone if it happens. But it's the difference between our children's children having a decent life or a bad life or no life at all. And that's why we shouldn't shut up about it. And of course, Benny would be delighted with your question, and that's another reason why we shouldn't, I think, go completely down the route you're suggesting. Benny would be delighted because doubt is his product, right? That's what he's here for. He and his organisation and people like UKIP and the BNP and the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, what they are about is causing people to have doubt about science, and causing people to have doubt about whether precautious action should be taken. So the fundamental reason why so many people are fed up about hearing about dangerous climate change is because people like him have turned it into a confusing issue and made it unclear what we should do.
Hang on,
These are the facts. These are the facts.
Well, hang on. One of the facts is how people feel about it. I mean, the fact we started with was that this woman feels a bit disenchanted with it. So let's just...
Sorry, I don't want to dominate.
No, but I think this is part of what we're
I was
getting
just cross because I think people are sick of hearing about it because we're sick of being preached about it. Millions is spent, people going to conferences arguing about it. It suits big business and it suits governments to deflect it, all the argument towards the climate rather than about the fact that millions of people haven't got clean water and lots of other fundamental questions. And as I said before, whether or not the climate's changing, we've got to stop polluting, poisoning and despoiling the earth.
So you wouldn't disagree with each other, it's just about actually whether...
But you mustn't lose sight of the risk of runaway climate change, right? It could extinguish human civilization as we know it.
I'm just going to allow Benny to ask a question because, and then we'll have one more question.
I mean, if you are so concerned about runaway greenhouse effect and climate change, why do you think the Greens are opposed to the least carbon-intensive form of energy, nuclear energy?
Okay, well, my answer to why I'm opposed to nuclear energy is because it is fundamentally unprecautious and fundamentally asymmetrical in its effect. Hang on. What we are doing when we create vast amounts of nuclear waste is we are creating something which will last hundreds of thousands of years, and we've got no idea what to do with it, right? You need to stop and think about that. Every time anybody says, oh, but nuclear power is low carbon, all right? You've got something which is highly, highly toxic. It will last hundreds of thousands of years. We've got no idea what to do with it. If you do not carefully manage that stuff for several hundred years, it catches fire, and the fires will burn for several hundred years, right? That's what the cooling areas are. Places that unless you keep them cool for about 100 years, they will catch fire and burn into the atmosphere for several hundred years. So nuclear power is another massive gamble. What we have to do is think about how we can have a world, and here I completely agree with you, where we can be pretty confident that we're not recklessly gambling with the future. That's why various technologies need to be scaled down or ruled out.
Right, I'm going to take one more question from the floor and then ask, the gentleman got his hand up there first, and in answering the question, I just ask the panel, it's also your chance to just wrap up because we're just about running out of time. Yes?
Thank you. Rupert made two comments in his introduction. The first was that the Greens, and particularly Rupert presumably, bases everything they do on good science. And the second was the fundamental importance of the precautionary principle. Regarding the first, virtually everything that Rupert has said since betrays a deep ignorance of the science. The most important scientific fact at the moment is that for the last 16 years there has been no global warming, a fact acknowledged by the IPCC. Over that same period of time, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased by 8%. That is a test of the hypothesis which Rupert is espousing, that carbon dioxide emissions will cause dangerous global warming. We have a scientific test of it, it is not so. Moving to the precautionary principle, computer models of the IPCC suggest that in 2020, never mind 2100, the temperature will be warmer than today. Other equally valid science, not models, suggest that in 2020 the temperature will be cooler than today because we are living in a solar quiet period. If you do not know in 10 years' time whether the temperature will be higher or lower, let alone in 90 years' time, how would you intend to apply the precautionary principle?
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there. I'm just going to say, I'm going to put this to you, Benny, and we're going to finish off by going round. I just want to say, from the outsider, it sounds a little bit like, we've got a true believer and a heretic or a skeptic, and it's a kind of spiritual or religious argument being fought out using scientific evidence as the kind of text. And there's clearly a way to debate it. It's almost, it does sound religious in kind. What's your? I don't want you to touch on the detail of what's just been said.
Well,
where have you
it's an empirical observational fact that is now generally accepted, that the global temperature has not changed for the last 16 years. So the warming trend that we saw in the 1980s and the 1990s has come to a halt, temporary halt. No one knows. No one even knows whether it's going to go up in the next 3 years or going down, because the gentleman rightly said we are in a period A where the sun is inactive, but that might not play such a big role, and B, we've moved into a cold phase in terms of ocean cycles, which have a kind of 30-year cycle. So no one knows. But the fact that the global warming trend that was manifest in the 1980s and 90s has come to an arrest, and we have a very stable, for the last 16 years, stable global temperature, has led people, including governments around the world, to say, hold on, you know, perhaps it's not as dangerous and not as dramatic as we were told. This is one of the reasons why governments themselves around the world are actually rolling back a lot of the policies. I mean, subsidies are...
You think this is a good thing? A good, rational treatment of the data?
It's not whether it's good or whether it's bad. It's inevitable, because what we heard today is completely unrealistic. The idea that the world can... The world, and not even talking about the UK, where energy demand in China and India is going to treble. I mean, we're talking about 3 billion people in China, India alone, half of which will be living in cities and will have a very similar lifestyle to our lifestyle. Their energy demand is going to treble in the next 30 years. To think that we can live without nuclear, without coal, without gas, without oil, which is what we've just heard, because all of them have risks, and therefore we can't use oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, and we can power the world on wind and solar. This is not only irrational, this is madness.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to go to Rupert. I'm going to come to you last, Alastair. Rupert, it's irrational dogma.
Look, as I said before, what we have to do is we have to contract and converge. And we have to act fundamentally proportionally, and that means, sir, that when you don't know exactly what's going to happen, it makes it more important, not less important, often, to act. When you can model precisely what's going to happen, that's the easy situation. The situation we're in is in a much harder situation. In that much harder situation, we have to make decisions based on criteria of proportion. And we are going to have to make revolutionary changes if we want our species to survive and to flourish. Think of the kind of changes that were made during the Second World War. In 1 year, the American auto industry was essentially shut down and converted into a tank production industry. In this country, we brought in food rationing, which before it was brought in was denounced as a sort of communist conspiracy, and everybody said it would never work, and so on and so forth. We made those things work because we cared and because we knew that radical, dramatic change is needed. Radical, dramatic change is needed if we are going to survive and flourish, if we're going to stop the biodiversity catastrophe, if we're going to avert climate catastrophe, if we're going to reattune ourselves to living in some kind of harmony with our world.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave the last word to you, Alastair. Can you re-spiritualise us and reinvigorate our determinations to help the world?
My friend James Jones, the Bishop of Liverpool, who you mentioned earlier, sent me something he'd written where he was describing how he too flies on low-cost airlines, notwithstanding his environmental consciousness and all the rest of it. We are all conflicted, we are all complicit, we are all caught in these contradictions. And he described how he was flying from Belfast to Liverpool John Lennon Airport. And as the plane took off, an almighty storm broke, and everybody was sitting there grim-faced, rigid in their seats, faces pale. And finally the plane landed safely, and as it landed, the gentleman sitting beside James said to him, "Actually, I knew that was going to be a terrible flight. You see, I'm an airline pilot, but I didn't want to frighten you. What do you do?" To which James replied, "Well, actually, I'm a priest, but I didn't want to frighten you."
We're all airline pilots or priests. Just before we go, I want to say that there's obviously lots more to talk about. Tomorrow you can... Is it tomorrow? You're talking,
tomorrow at 11.
Tomorrow at 11 you can hear more from Rupert.
Bishop, not a priest.
You can join Alastair at 4 o'clock, which I'm sure he'll be going to this debate called "This Debate Has No Title."
No. I'm not on
It's
that.
it's a postmodern debate, which
But
you'll enjoy a great deal.
I'm getting on the train now back north.
Terrific.
I've got to fly.
You won't be there. The debate has no title. That's at 4 o'clock. There's some other stuff going on. I'll be chairing some other stuff. Can you please join me in thanking our guests, Rupert, Alastair, and Benny? Thank you.